Good evening, everybody. My name is Greg Braylock Jr., and I serve as the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at ProMedica. We are so glad that you decided to join us here tonight for the first authors event of 2021 in celebration of Black History Month. Toledo-Lucas County Public Library will continue to elevate BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color, and women's voices throughout the year. Please consider joining the library for any of these future events. Authors with Sister Soldier, March 31st, virtual Black Lives Matter book club, March 23rd and April 27th, a virtual Women's History Month book club, March 11th, the American Woman in World War II, an online and in-person exhibit at Main Library beginning March 1st, and also Toledo Women Walking Tour, a 4-part podcast highlighting women who made a difference in various Toledo neighborhoods, also beginning on March 1st. You know, ProMedica is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we believe first and foremost it is just the right thing to do. We want everybody to be able to live their authentic lives as their authentic selves. We believe that if anybody experiences racism, discrimination, any form of bias, it's our job as leaders in our community to do something about it. We believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion, it makes us a stronger employer. It helps us to provide better healthcare to those that we serve. And at the end of the day, it creates stronger communities that are more inclusive and innovative. You know, as we look at what we want to accomplish this year in 2021, just like many, we've learned a lot over the last year. We want to bring our resources to bear in more meaningful and impactful ways to impact not just social and economic equity in our communities, but also racial equity. So stay tuned. We'll be doing a lot this year, and I'm sure many of you will be excited to join in. So before we start, I want to thank our presenting sponsor, the Library Legacy Foundation, for their generous financial support. Gifts to the foundation allow the library to continue to offer great programs like the one you're viewing tonight, along with countless others. We are also incredibly grateful to presenting media sponsors, Buckeye Broadband and The Blade, the supporting sponsor, Bureau Group, and the community sponsor, the Friends of the Library. This program is being recorded and will be uploaded to the library YouTube channel. Staff are monitoring Facebook Live and the Zoom chat function, so send in your questions. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for the evening, the Executive Director of the Toledo-Lucas County Public Library, Jason Kuchma. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks, Greg. Good to see you.
And now to our featured author for the evening. Her new book, The Rib King, taps into seldom explored aspects of African-American experience, issues of appropriation, commercial exploitation, class, and racial denigration that have finally come to the forefront in America's recent racial and equity reckoning. Blending history, mystery, and social commentary, The Rib King is a riveting and well-timed drama that arrives as America takes a careful look at exploitation of African-American culture. Ladee Hubbard is the author of The Talented Ripkins, which received the 2018 Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literacy Excellence and the Hurston Wright Legacy Award for debut fiction. Born in Massachusetts and raised in the U.S. Virgin Islands and Florida, she currently lives in New Orleans with her husband and 3 children. I'd like to welcome Ladee Hubbard.
Okay. Hi.
Hello, hello. Good to see you.
Yeah, nice to be here.
Are you at home in New Orleans right now?
Yes. Yes.
How about that introduction from Greg? That was fantastic. It's as I was thinking about our conversation tonight, I was thinking about how this book cannot be more perfectly timed. It certainly strikes, as he was saying, it strikes on so many different chords. And so I'm looking forward to a conversation with you tonight about that book. And as I admitted to you before we got on the air, I read the books in reverse order. Read the Rib King first, and then the Talented Ripkins second. And so there's some interesting dialogue and some challenges and parallels there that we can talk through as well.
Sure. Yeah.
Let's dive right into the conversation. As folks know, they can ask questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring those and get to those a little bit later in our time together. For folks that haven't read it, The Rib King is based on the patriarch of the family in the first book, The Talented Ripkins. can you talk a little bit about how you developed that character from Ripkins? It was, this abstract face on a label and create this rich story around him.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's set in 1914, and then in the second half is 10 years after that. But the character originated with the first book as the family patriarch. So he was always sort of an emblem that had meaning. The meanings that he was given were given in the present, right? So he has a certain meaning in the present. And I think when I first thought it was a way to think about the role of tradition and history in people's lives in the present, right? So somehow when it occurred to me to expand his story and actually tell what his life was like, I was very much thinking about current events at the same time. So I think that is part of what, it's just sort of inherent to the way I conceive the book. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. For folks that maybe not know about that long timeline of when you start to think about a book to when it actually lands in people's hands, when were you working on this? Just to give people sort of a context.
Well, yeah. So I was still writing and trying to figure out how to write the first book. So I started writing his story it was around 2014. So before the first book came out. And yeah, so at the, I overwrite because that was my very first novel, The Talented Ripkins.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was just part of sort of teaching myself how to write a novel that ultimately I pretty much know absolutely everything about every character in that book, right? Clearly back to the lives of their ancestors, their long deceased ancestors. So it was part of me trying to figure out the family. Because the Talented Ripkins is contemporary novel, so it's just I just wrote everything. I wrote out everything, so it was part of the research for the first book.
Well, let's talk about that because, as Greg was saying in the introduction, this book is meticulously researched. It is incredibly rich with history, and you are a historian. You are a researcher, writer. What does that process look like for you in trying to paint that picture in such rich vibrancy?
What I have a long time. I used to be sort of an academic, and I have a PhD in folklore and mythology, and my dissertation was actually on the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. So it's a lot of research that I didn't realize I was researching the novel when I wrote my dissertation. And actually, when I wrote it, I had very different preoccupations, but it was in the process of doing research for that I learned a lot about that time period, and in particular, the sort of the birth of or the beginnings of commodity culture in the United States. So that was a very important, and the Chicago World's Fair was actually very important in terms of introducing the idea of commodities to a lot of people. And so it's a lot of research. It doesn't look very organized is also part of what I'm trying to say. Like when I'm researching something, it's just something I'm very interested in. So I didn't realize I would one day be writing a book about a man who appears on the label of a meat sauce can when I was doing that. So, yeah.
And history's messy, right? I mean,
history is very messy. Yeah.
And you're able to sort of keep all of those threads together and to paint a picture. That for the folks that haven't read this, the book is broken up into two viewpoints. You have Mr. Sitwell and you have Jenny. Jenny Williams, 10 years apart, and they have very different responses to what is taking place in the book. And I was wondering what inspired those two different perspectives, and maybe if you could talk about, how those perspectives relate to, what you were seeing in the world at the time you were writing it, or even now.
Well, when I started writing it, it was around the time that the Black Lives Matter hashtag was starting to get a lot of attention, and it was in response to the the murder of Trayvon Martin. So, and there was also, it's not that, it feels like it was a long time ago. It actually really wasn't, but there was a lot of talk about the vulnerability of African-American children to racial violence. So in the book, the path that the main character's name is August Sitwell, and he's the man that ultimately becomes the Rib King. And what he's preoccupied with is trying to care for these 3 orphan children, these 3 boys that live in the house with him. So amid all the other things that are going on around him, it's really about sort of the anxiety and the various threats that these children face. And I think I was really struck by the level of anxiety that parents might feel today, not having changed as much as you would imagine it has over the past 100 years, but it's still, I mean, it was such a prominent thought. And so that's, I think, was definitely a real link for me. And it actually, the events of the past summer and all these protests and the fact that somehow they seem to have led to a reaction of what we're gonna get rid of, like Aunt Jemima, these things that actually, and Aunt Jemima originated at the Chicago World's Fair. And I believe that the cream of wheat man Rastus did as well. So it's been over 100 years, and all this, and it's in response to these protests, these massive protests that are going on. So that was kind of a weird symmetry that all of that would happen once I'd finally finished writing the book, and it comes out the same year that we're going to get rid of all of these icons. So yeah. Very strange.
Truly.
Well, because that's actually what inspired me to write the book in the first place, was the protests that were going on at that time, or the beginnings of it. So yeah, it's just, it's interesting. And in between both of those things, it was often very difficult to explain why I wanted to write this book that's set 100 years ago as a reaction to things that are happening in the present. Do you know what I mean? Like, people would say, oh, this is my response to it. I'm going to write about, commodity culture in the beginning of the 20th century. And you know what I mean? So it's interesting.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that was, I think, so interesting to me as I was reading it. This is, you have some time jumping that happens, and with the parallels to what's happening now, I found myself, stopping, pausing, and thinking about how relevant so many of those aspects were then and still today.
Yeah.
Talk a little. Yeah. Go ahead. What were you gonna say?
No, I was just gonna say, in terms of the Rib King and Ginny, and the fact that it's divided into 2 sections like that, because I think that's actually what you asked me, and I kind of went off on a slightly different tangent.
We can go wherever you want to go.
Well, because I think that his story is very nihilistic in a certain sense, right? It's a sad story, and there's a certain logic to it, but I don't think I didn't feel like that really was accurate in terms of representing African-American culture. Right. So Ginny is kind of, in a way, a reaction. Her section is, like, for me, felt like a reaction to his section, because they do respond to sort of trauma and these same sort of difficulties in radically different ways. So when I was writing it, when I got to the end of his story, that did not feel like really the end or a complete statement. If I was trying to talk about larger issues, that did not feel like that fully encompassed what I was trying to say. So in a lot of ways, I feel like her section is a reaction to his section. I don't know if that makes sense for me as the writer.
Yeah, no,
it's
it
a
makes sense
response to it. Yeah.
How you mentioned that people sort of there were questions about how do you rationalize, or how do you explain this book as your response to this historical fiction as a response to what's happening today? What does that look like to you? I mean, how do you tell that story?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think it seems to make more sense by the time it came out. It made more sense. We've gone through a lot of difficult changes between 2014 and today. Things have radically shifted, and I think the way that people talk about that these kinds of issues has actually changed quite a bit. In a really, considering the whole history of the United States in a pretty short period of time. And so that's been very interesting. It does not seem confusing to people anymore, like what the connections are. So,
Right.
and I felt like it was a little bit more difficult to explain when I was actually writing it, when people would ask me. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, once you pick it up, it's pretty clear that the parallel. Yeah, it makes complete sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more? You mentioned Jenny's sort of a response to Mr. Sitwell's nihilism. Talk a little bit about her perspective and how you parse that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that they're very different reactions to, in a certain sense, you talk about their personalities as very different reactions to trauma. They both endured a lot of trauma, and they respond to it in really different ways. Again, for me as the writer, sometimes it feels like it's the difference between hiding and performing, because when the book begins, Mr. Sitwell is really hiding. He's hiding from himself. And that's sort of how he is trying to deal with trauma. And Ginny is a literal performer, right? When they first meet her, she was a dancer, and she performed with her daughter that she had at a very young age, and they performed as sisters. So she literally is a performer, but I think that she performs roles in order to survive, and she will pretend to do what she has to do to sort of, make her way through the world, but she's not hiding from herself, right? So that to me is a very big difference between the two characters. And she's also, she's very hopeful, right? She's very determined to not be sort of toppled by hardships that she has had to face. And they both are, pretty much everyone in the book is dealing with trauma on a certain level and in different ways, but those two are the starkest contrast. And I do think that a lot of times I think about the contributions that African Americans have made to this culture and society, even when they're not acknowledged or recognized. And there's something very illogical about it, because I feel like his story is much more linear, and for me at least, it felt much more sort of like a logical progression for him. And there's something very illogical about the sort of hopefulness and the willingness to, I'm going to keep trying. Okay, that didn't work. I'll try something else. And I think that is, for me, that is also a very strong part of African American culture and history. And so she, in a certain sense, represents that for me. Yeah. You don't give up.
Right.
You don't give in. You keep going. There are people depending on you to keep it together. And she sort of embodies that for me.
That's a lot. That's a lot of responsibility.
Yeah. It's a lot. Yeah.
The book, obviously, the identity of Black America has sort of been challenged over the centuries, and the book takes place 50 to 60 years after the end of slavery. But treating African Americans as a commodity while not recognizing them as individuals is obviously still present. And it's remarkable that 100 plus years later, we're still dealing with that and reconciling with that. I appreciate how you tackled that. How bizarre was it to, and I guess maybe I was looking to see how you could explain or how you frame the fact that so much has happened in the last 5 to 10 years after 100 plus years of this commodification of the Black identity.
What do you mean? So much has happened in the in terms of commodification of identity, or?
Sure. Or even the fact that we're reconciling the fact or understanding how those identities have been commodified, or the quickness within, thinking about getting rid of the Aunt Jemima character or the cream of wheat, those sort of things, how quickly those things have happened in the historical context, because I think folks don't realize necessarily how we got here.
Right. Well, I kind of feel like it's the things that people are talking about now are
Mhm.
things that have been going on for a very, very long time. And
Right.
I think that it's been such extreme circumstances in terms of dealing with the pandemic. And then you have all, just thinking about sort of the impact of sort of systematic exclusion and things like that, the long-term impact just feels like a lot has, I think people were very stressed out. I think it's just come to the surface. And the George Floyd thing was so incredibly ugly and tragic. But it's not new to the past 5 or 10 years. I don't, it's hard for me to say. Do you know what I mean? Like what that really means long term, because I don't think the things that are underlining these things are new. They're not new specific to the past decade. They've been going on for so long. So yeah, it's hard for me to say.
I think that, and I think that's what I was getting at a little bit.
Yeah.
I think that folks see what's happening in the last 5 to 10, 15 years and see that as something new. But here,
well, yeah, it's been very extreme, I think. So, I mean, it's been very hard to maybe shut out the way people might normally prefer to do. But yeah, I think it's definitely manifestations of things that have been around for so very long and not really dealt with. There's just a lot of unreconciled things. So, and I would see them again. I probably, for me, the icon of that would be like Aunt Jemima in the store shelves, or the cream of wheat man, who no one seems to know. His name is Rastus. His name is Rastus, but no one seems to. Everyone's like, really? That's his name? Like, yes, his name was. He's just standing there, like smiling and presiding over all these things that no one really has talked about in a very honest way, or seldom talk about in very honest ways. So, yeah.
And that brings up the question I was thinking, for folks that are watching now that haven't had a chance to read the book, there's a message of hope here, but there's also, as you said, there's some nihilism. What's the sort of overarching thing that you want folks to walk away from after they read The Rib King?
Well, there's a lot going on in the book. I know. For me, it really, what it left me with, is to think about how much sort of African Americans have contributed to the culture. And I sometimes say, when people ask me, what is the book about? And you said, it's like, this is during the period of the Great Migration, the beginning of the Great Migration. And you have all of these people trying to assert their rights as citizens, right? And the transition from, it's like a struggle from, they were once considered commodities, and it's the struggle, in a certain sense, could be talked about as the struggle to be recognized as the producers of culture, as opposed to commodities. So in the midst of all of these very complicated and yet not particularly complicated things that are going on symbolically with minstrelsy and stuff like that, it's really, for me, it was about the sort of strength and intelligence and yes, the contributions of African Americans to American US culture as a whole that are often not recognized. So this is like me. Ginny is very obsessed. She's runs a beauty parlor. She wants to get her product up on the shelf, right? Yeah. So everyone can see it. And so it's just, for me, it was like a testament to that struggle to get it up on the shelf where everyone can see it and acknowledge what she had done, right? Yeah. So that's what it's about for me. Yeah.
And how do, if folks come away with a better understanding of that sort of long narrative that we've inherited with so much trauma,
It is
how
trauma. Yeah.
do we have, where do you find hope in people having honest conversations about that? And where in today, thinking about whether folks read this book or in general and dealing with the times. And it's, I realize it's a pretty big question, but I'm curious.
Where do I find hope in terms of that?
In how we can have those honest conversations. Where are you seeing hope in those conversations happening today?
Oh gosh, I really was inspired by the protests and people coming out, and I don't know, I feel like maybe it has, because again it's been so extreme, maybe it has provoked people to realize that these are not things that can be ignored, right? They're very real and they still have repercussions, and I think it's not easy to deal with them. So I don't know. I think it just requires a lot of sincere commitment to reconcile and work through, because there's a lot of things that are very deeply embedded in the culture that really need to be addressed and dealt with in an honest way. And that's not easy for anyone. So I don't know. Someone asked me if I thought things had really changed, or if a lot of these things were just performative gestures. And I don't know. I feel like that's not for me to say. I don't know if they are or not. I hope they're not. And I do believe that there are some people that are seriously grappling with racism and other things that are really sort of tragic and problematic about the culture that we live in, because that's what it requires. It's not an easy thing to work through. Yeah.
And it's not something we accomplish just 1 month out of the year, right?
No.
Which, I was glad Greg had a chance to talk about that a little bit. One of our commitments here at the library is around having those honest conversations with our community and being a catalyst for those kinds of discussions. And so the Black Lives Matter book club and women's history work, and that we're hoping will be more year round, as opposed to these sort of single months that we have these discussions.
That's really great. And I think that's really important. It's just to have honest discussions about it and do really honest work on that, and to be committed. It requires a lot of commitments. That's wonderful to hear. Yeah.
Can I ask you a little bit about the Talented Ripken, since
Sure.
I did just and so in there the protagonists, Johnny and Eloise, find a family scrapbook, and it's filled with well, first of all, let's talk a little bit about the context for folks that might not have read it yet. It's based on a W.E.B. Du Bois, The Talented 10th Essay. Can you talk a little bit about the scope of the novel?
Yeah. So it's based on that. It's really about the reaction or the impact of that essay. Because it kind of became, sometimes people use it as shorthand for like the upper class, the Black upper class, or the leadership class. And I guess it also sounds like a superhero group a little bit to me, the Talented 10th, like the Fantastic Four or something. So I was kind of playing with that. And so in a certain sense, the main character is he's an older man, and he has a debt. And so he's going and he's digging holes, and he's left money in holes in the ground and all these different places in his past, and he's digging up the holes. And so it's like a reckoning with his past. But in the course of doing that, it kind of becomes his life story. And so for me, in part, it was like an allegory of the Black leadership class, like over sort of the second half of the 20th century, like beginning in the 1950s, because you kind of follow his life from the 1950s to around like 2000. So does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I loved it. And I think one of the things that struck me was there's a moment when they're looking through a scrapbook filled with photographs and news clippings that chart the contested history of race in the United States. And they make a point of saying that the album isn't really this account of the past. And you mentioned that it's an annotated manual on the art of reading between the lines.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about that from a researcher perspective? How do you?
Well, because it's in the scrapbook and the newspaper clippings, he's referencing like an official narrative of history. And again, a lot of things are excised from that narrative. And a lot of, in terms of like African-American participation and what was really going on, because it's trying to tell a very specific story. And so the person that made that scrapbook, he made it for his children. And he's pointing out that as a result of trying to tell this specific story, if you look very carefully, there are things that do not make sense, or that they gloss over certain facts. They're making connections between things, and like something's missing in the middle, but it so happens so quickly. If you don't pay very careful attention, you might miss it. And so he's trying to teach his children, this is his specific, that's his project, right? It's not of everybody, and that's this specific character's project, how to read history critically, or to take official narratives of history, how to read it critically and not just believe what you're being told is the moral of this particular story. And that is like a very important, that's a very important thing in terms of self-knowledge and in terms of Black cultural knowledge, because a lot of things are left out or excised. But if you look very, very closely and are very critical, you can discern that there is something missing often, right? So that's what that section was about. Yeah.
And about that sort of informal history where you reading between the lines. How do you think 50, 100 years from now we're going to piece together the informal history of today?
I don't know if that's a very, I can't, that's really hard to predict. I do on occasion think about how people are going to talk about this particular period of history, like how in the world will it be represented later on? And it probably will depend on sort of the ideas and attitudes of a future generation, what they have to say about right now. It's actually also a issue for the Rib King as well, because what sets him off is seeing a book that he feels is actually about his past, and it's and it does not conform to his memories of what happened, this traumatic event from his childhood. And he's hiding from himself, so he's not been thinking about this at all, but he sees himself in the lies because something in him knows that it's lying. And that's actually what forces him to start remembering and thinking about what he had been through. So in another way, that is a confrontation with sort of official narratives of history. Although in The Rib King, it's actually a penny novel that someone has written. It's like an adventure story, but it's really, really resembles things that happened to him when he was a child, except they're telling it wrong. They're telling it completely wrong. And he knows that. Yeah.
And I don't know if this is a correct attribution, but it reminded me of what I've learned was an African proverb of, until lions have their own historians, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.
That's true.
These are reclaiming those narratives, and
there's a need. There's a need for proof too, because a lot of things are oral because people don't. It has to do with power dynamics as well. What is considered an official history? So there are a lot of things that, and it's especially an intense issue when you're thinking about your ancestors and history of like the period when people were slaves or after. Who is telling their stories? Who is representing who these people were, what their experiences were? And it's particularly intense when people were literally banned from writing and reading in the South. So But honestly, it's still true. And when I think of like George Floyd and things like that, the need to prove that these things happen and that they're a real issue. People have been saying that for a very, very long time, but there's this constant need to prove it, to have documentation for these things. And again, that's part of Mr. Sitwell's. He has no proof that what he remembers actually happened because it was never properly documented. All he has is his own memories. So in both what you meant about the scrapbook and the Talented Ribkins and also the reaction to sort of this misrepresentation of his past is sort of engaged with that issue and the need for proof, right? Which is still a big thing today. You know what I mean?
Right, yeah. People needing to prove facts, right? And I think too about
in a whole many different ways it comes up. So even in terms of like the changing of like Aunt Jemima or these sports teams and stuff like that, people have been. It's not new that people found them offensive or that they had their origins in minstrelsy and these very destructive and damaging stereotypes and. So the discovery suddenly that maybe we should think about, changing them is a little strange in some ways. Different kind of proof. Pressure is a different kind of proof, isn't it? Though, so
it's a groundswell, and it's now seems like a good time for me to ask you if you wouldn't mind reading a passage from the Rib King, if you have something you would like to share.
Oh, sure, yes, and I have a So as I was saying, Mr. Sitwell, the man who becomes the Rib King, he's very preoccupied with saving these 3 boys that work in the house. And so I was just going to read a section. This is the beginning of the 3rd chapter, which is called Needs Warning. And all of them wind up in sort of life-threatening situations, and he has to do different strategies to try and get them out of it. So this is him. This is the first boy has gotten arrested at the fair. And he's gotten arrested because he stole apples from the man who gives tickets to the Ferris wheel. He stole the apples when he was like 8, right? And he's like 15, but the man was mad. So he arrested him then. So he's running to try to save this boy and get him out of this jail. Okay, so this is called Needs Warning. I'm just going to read a few pages. Mr. Sitwell hurried through the garden and out the gate, headed towards the omnibus stop. As he ran, he thought about all the other orphans he'd known over the years, boys caught stealing and sent away, never to be heard from again. So many boys had come and gone since he'd started working in that house that he couldn't even remember most of their names. Their features blurred and blended in Sitwell's mind so that they all seemed sad semblances of the 2 who'd stood beside him on the back porch the day he arrived. Those boys had only lasted a few months before they were sent back to the asylum for stealing silverware, and ever after, the theft was how Mr. Sitwell knew that deep down he was still one of them. Because the truth was, when those 2 others were banished from the house, Mr. Sitwell had been stealing too. Somehow he just managed to not get caught. For the next 20 years, he'd worked in that house and never once thought to intervene. Yet here he was running. What was it that made these boys different? What was it that made him run? All he could think was that it had something to do with Barclay asking him to choose between them, that somehow it had had the effect of making him feel responsible for them, accountable not only for the answer he had come up with, but also for his own determination not to give it. The bus pulled to the curb. He climbed aboard a crowded car and found himself wedged between 2 men in sanitation uniforms. He paid his fare, pushed past the men, and stood near a group of women in frock coats arguing in some Slavic language. The driver yelled, "Push back," and Mr. Sitwell took a few more steps towards the rear of the car. He stopped next to a heavyset man in a blue fedora. He reached for the handrail and looked down at an elderly woman in the seat in front of him, humming to herself with her eyes closed. The car lurched and rumbled down Oleana Avenue, then rounded a corner headed past Magazine. He climbed down near the park and made his way through the remnants of the fairgrounds. During the exposition, it was estimated that more than 1 million people had come to the city to see the fair, but there wasn't much to look at anymore. The entire exposition had been conceptualized as an object lesson for the modern worker, meant to demonstrate the many marvels of capitalism, a display of the collective fruits of industrial labor. Its actual construction had involved 5 years of brutal, back-breaking labor on the part of hundreds of men tasked with the arduous job of clearing an entire swamp. Several had died in the process, and for most of the survivors, the glories of the fair had not proved sufficient compensation. Much of it had been reduced to cinders not a year after the exposition closed, a casualty of a workers' strike. He walked past the brackish water of a man-made lagoon where, during the exposition, people had ridden paddle boats carved in the shape of swans. The year of the exposition was the same year Mr. Sitwell came to work for the Barclay House. He'd gone to visit just once before it was burned, on Colored American Day. The 2 other orphans brought in with him had been sent away just a few weeks before when Mamie, then a chambermaid, found him crying beneath the kitchen table following some altercation with Mr. Boudreau. She'd managed to coax him out from under the table, dried his tears, and then, in an effort to cheer him up, insisted he accompany her to hear Frederick Douglass speak. They'd ridden to the fairgrounds, pushed past the aggressive crowds, and made their way to Festival Hall. He remembered Mamie holding his hand as they walked through the front rotunda, pointing out the display tables full of charts and indices of Negro improvement since emancipation. He'd nodded at the sight of them, although in truth he could barely read, and so was able to make little sense of the progress they claimed to record. Then there was the thunder of applause, and Mr. Sitwell turned around in time to see the old man take the stage on the arm of a small white woman whose mother, Mamie explained, had written the script for the very first Tom show. For the next 2 hours, Frederick Douglass spoke in a deep, sonorous voice that reverberated throughout the hall, a memory supplanted by the rapid flutter of several hundred handheld fans in the audience. When Douglass was finished, there was more applause. People rose to their feet, and Mamie, deeply moved by the dignity of the man, had begun to cry. She and Mr. Sitwell went back outside and walked around the ethnic pavilion, where exotic specimens from various lands had been invited to perform their native songs and dances for the public. Mamie bought him a box of Cracker Jacks, and then, for the first time, told him about her life before she'd come to work for the Barclays. She told him how her mother had been born a slave to one of Mr. Barclay's cousins, and that she'd spent her childhood working for the same people who once would have owned her. She told him that this fact had caused her mother a great deal of pain, and she'd realized the only way to change Mamie's fate was for her to leave home. So arrangements had been made for her to come and work for the Barclays at the age of maturity, which in her case was apparently 14. She told him she missed her mother terribly, but insisted that wasn't why she was crying. Instead, it had to do with the fact that it wasn't until she'd come to the city that she'd even realized Mr. Douglass was colored. I'd heard his name spoken a few times while I was helping my mother serve dinner, always in the most disparaging terms, and always, it seemed, in conjunction with a Mr. John Brown. Somehow I must have got it in my head that the 2 were related. She dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Can you imagine, Sitwell, being so ignorant? It never occurred to me that such a Negro man could even exist. And then I think that perhaps I would have never known if my mother had not had the strength and courage to compel me to come here and leave everything I knew behind. Mr. Sitwell sat and watched her cry. They were only separated by 5 years, but what a difference that small span of time had made then. He hadn't the slightest idea how to comfort her. But he does exist, Mr. Sitwell said. Doesn't that make you feel better? Of course it does. So why are you sad? I'm not sad. She took a deep breath as she attempted to regain control of her emotions. Then she smiled. People don't always cry because they are sad, Sitwell. You should remember that. Then they shared up the box of Cracker Jacks while they stood on the boardwalk and watched the Dahomey men dance for money. Yeah, I'll stop there, but I like
Lovely.
that
Thank you.
section because there's actually a lot going on in that little scene that has to do with the rest of the book.
That's perfect section. Thank you for that. As you were reading, it just, I think it reinforces how your novel has, it has race history, class history, gender, consumer culture history, all woven into the story. That's just really remarkable. And even as I was reading, I'm wondering how you did it. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
So complicated yet so compelling as well. I'm going to ask some folks to ask any questions in the chat window if they like, but I do have a couple more questions for you.
Okay.
I know that Toni Morrison was your thesis advisor at Princeton, and we just celebrated Toni Morrison Day in Ohio because she's from Ohio.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, it was. This was the first year when our legislators had passed that bill to declare Toni Morrison Day. Could you talk a little bit about what you learned from her and what advice you might pass on to future generations from your time with her?
Oh my goodness. Well, she's why I started writing fiction. Because I was just such a huge fan. I thought she was so amazing. And when I met her, I was very young and I only wrote poetry because she was my thesis advisor, and when I was an undergraduate.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to meet her initially. And I just wanted to write something so that I could show it to her. And, but, she really did, I don't know. I'd never read anything like that before. So maybe my high school reading probably was very limited. I had not been exposed to very many African-American writers, and certainly not to one that had the impact on me that she did. Just her work was so complex, the way she represented, I just felt like her characters were real people and they spoke to me, and I just so admired the complexity of the characters and also the artistry in terms of the way she structured her books, like the depth and resonance with which she structured her books. They were so I don't know, complex, and there was something very real and gripping about that. And all of her books are, for me, they're so distinct and different. So I was so impressed and in awe of her. So I think that for me, she really was someone that showed me what was possible, right? What you could do with language in a book and a work of fiction, and how also too that I could really see the ways in which, and I still believe this as a writer, that sometimes a work of fiction is a way to get to sort of a deeper truth, right? Than if you were just writing history and nonfiction. I, again, am a fiction writer, so that's my perspective, but it is very much a part of what motivates me. And I think, and it was certainly part of what was so gripping about her work to me as a younger person, was that it just really did seem a way to access deeper truths and to sort of make different connections between things that were going on in the world. Your own connections and deeper connections. So all of that was just extremely important to me, and what I saw as my own goals in terms of writing. Yeah. And then, working with her, she was really, really encouraging in terms of experimentation. And I don't think I really knew what I was doing a lot of the time back then in terms of the work I showed her. I wish I'd had something more sort of mature and developed to show her, but she seemed to really respect the fact that I was trying, and she was very encouraging about taking risks and doing different things and trying to really find my own way through language to express something that was me. Do you know what I mean? Like to
Yeah.
really find that. And I don't remember her ever discouraging experimentation, even things that didn't work. Sometimes I might have shown her something really ridiculous and she might have, kind of laughed, but it wasn't like, don't do this again, this is wrong. I don't remember her ever telling me that something that I was trying to do was wrong. So I felt very respected, and that was really important as well. So yeah.
Do you now, or have you had a relationship as a mentor with other young writers?
Not yet. I mean, I really, this is my second novel only. I know I have not, I was doing something totally different, but I don't think that I wouldn't consider myself to have been a mentor to anyone in that sense. So
not yet.
I try to be encouraging and supportive, and I do teach on occasion, but I don't. When you talk about mentors, I can't really see myself as having that kind of impact on someone yet. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
I know what you're saying, but I find that very hard to believe. Just having had this short time to talk with you. Greg, who did our introduction, has a question that I'd like to read. And he says that Jenny's character in Rib King reminds him of present-day personification of Black excellence. From a historical perspective, he wants to know, are there other periods of time that remind you of that push to highlight achievement in African-American culture and a broader mindset of ownership, breaking molds, and living freely? Other periods of time that you particularly point to?
Other periods of time. I don't know. I don't know if I understand the question, like a specific time period where that was like a big issue or something.
I think so. Yeah. Or maybe some, obviously this is a thread that's run through history for over 100 years, but are there peaks and valleys of that where it's more prevalent maybe?
That's interesting. Well, I guess you could talk about, I've always thought that you could talk about, there's some mention of respectability politics and in the book, because that was, part of the ethos, just part of it though. And I think you could talk about the civil rights movement in terms of that as well. Did he mean specifically in terms of women or just in general?
That's a good question. So I don't know. We don't.
Yeah, but no, I mean, I was recently thinking about that in terms of like the politics of respectability and how that played into sort of the rationale for the civil rights movement as well. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a very complicated topic for me to try to come up with for, but yeah.
Absolutely. And honestly, as I was preparing and thinking about talking with you today, 45 minutes or so is not nearly enough time to get in at all the sort of nuances of the book and how many sort of touchstones there are, I think, throughout American history. Here's another question from one of our viewers. For me, your book speaks to trauma and how people respond to it. And all of these characters, where are you as an individual, and how do you personally respond to what is happening in society right now? And what do you tell your children? What kind of conversations are you having with your children?
Oh, well, I try very hard to be like Jenny. Jenny is very and it's true of Johnny Ribkins as well. I think they sort of in the first novel. For me, they sort of represent I try to keep going and just see the value in continuing to try. What do I tell my children? I think that they all are responding to trauma. And again, I talk to them about that. I don't ever want my children to be afraid of who they are or afraid to express who they are. And I don't want them ever to be intimidated and feel like they cannot achieve their goals. So I sincerely mean that when I say to them that I believe anything they want to achieve is possible. And that is kind of a reaction to it. It's a hard thing to believe, and it's not logical. It's not, don't be realistic. Please don't be realistic about your goals. Seriously, because you
Yeah.
just have to keep going and keep trying. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that is what I try to teach my children, to believe in themselves and to not let the limitations that others might try to impose on them to not, that's not what's real. What's real is what emanates from them. I want them to believe that. Yeah.
Optimism and hope in the face of a time that's, that is anything but at certain times.
It takes a great deal of strength. So, it's like, it's not a Pollyanna thing at all. It actually, I think, takes a great deal of strength and courage to be yourself, right? Which is
Yep.
ultimately what we want, to be able to just be ourselves, right?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
I have another question for you from Rhonda Sewell. She works with me on the leadership team here. She's having a viewing party and with friends in social media, and she was wondering, are there lesser known Black female authors who inspire you, i.e. Nellie Larson, Margaret Wilson, and Petrie, to name a few? Who inspires you?
Oh, so many writers, contemporary writers or writers from, because you mentioned, like, I
You
really,
get to decide.
oh, well, lately, and it's just, there's a lot of writers I really admire. I've been thinking a lot about Toni Cade Bambara lately. And who else have I been thinking about lately? There was a book that a writer named Megan Giddings wrote last year called Lakewood that I really, really loved. And yeah, a lot. I'm inspired by a lot of writers. I've actually been thinking about Zora Neale Hurston. I'm writing another book, so it pertains to that. But there's so many. There's so many. So it just depends on what what. Yeah, it's hard to say almost. I'm there. I draw inspiration from so many people. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, since you mentioned it, I was going to ask, what are you working on now?
I actually have a collection of short stories coming out next year. And then I'm also working on another novel, as I always am. So yeah.
Will it be in the same family of these Talented Ripkins, or something completely different?
Completely different. I might go back. I mean, again, I really overwrote for the Talented Ripkins, so I know, there's probably several other novels in there that I can deal with one day. But the what I'm writing now is very different, and the collection of short stories are they're all set in the same town in Florida. Actually, it's like a small town in Florida, in a Black community, and they take place over a 20-year period. So
I look forward to that. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk to you about that when that book comes out. You said next year?
I would love that. Yeah, next year.
Well, don't go anywhere. We'll say goodbye to you off the air after we say goodbye to everyone else. But I wanted to thank you, Ladee Hubbard, for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure talking with you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
And thanks to all of our friends who joined us today to watch. You can pick up the Rib King or the Talented Ripkins at the library or at your independent bookstore. And thank you all for joining us this evening.